The desert does not speak, yet it remembers. It remembers the bones of men who thought themselves immortal, the broken wagons swallowed by sand, the last cries of riders who misjudged the horizon. Under the molten sun, the land lies still, cicadas humming in the heat, the air quivering as though the earth itself is holding its breath. Far out where the sky bleeds into the stone ridges, a lone cabin squats against the wind, its board sun-bleached and weathered, the kind of place a man disappears to when he wants to be forgotten. No one in the nearby town speaks the name of the man who lives there, not out of fear, but out of something deeper, respect, maybe, or superstition. His is a story told low over campfires, in words so sparse they leave more questions than answers. And today, across the desert floor, 6 riders are coming. They believe they're closing in on a solitary settler, an old man who will give them food and shelter or pay in blood if he refuses. They do not yet understand that they are riding toward the last mistake they will ever make. By the time the sun dips, their fate will be sealed, and most won't live to draw their first breath in the fight. In the late summer of 1881, the frontier was a place where lawmen were scarce, and justice traveled on horseback. Dust clung to every surface. Hunger wore men down to bone and sinew, and the wind itself seemed to carry the scent of gunpowder. Somewhere in that endless sprawl of scrub and shadow, Elias Boone kept to himself. His homestead stood on a slight rise, framed by a scattering of mesquite trees and a dry creek bed that hadn't seen water in 3 years. The cabin was small, built with the precision of a man who understood the value of strong walls and tight seams. A corral sat empty beside it, the old posts still sturdy despite the years. Elias himself was a figure that could pass for unremarkable if a man didn't know how to look. His hair was the color of driftwood, cropped short and practical. His beard carried more gray than black. Deep creases carved the skin around his eyes, but it was not age that made them, it was experience. His hands were rough, scarred in ways that spoke of more than farm work, the kind of marks you get from rope burns, blade edges, and old bullet grazes. He moved with a slow, measured calm, as though each action was chosen, weighed, and accepted before it was made. That morning, Elias sat on his porch with a tin cup of coffee, cooling in his grip. The desert was quiet except for the wind, and he listened to it the way other men listen to music. He knew every whisper and shift, the way it changed when strangers were near. He didn't look surprised when a faint dust cloud appeared on the horizon. His gaze followed it, steady, unblinking, like a man watching a storm approach. Miles away, the Iron Fong gang rode hard, their horses lathered and restless. 6 of them, each with a face worn hard by the road, and the kind of eyes that never looked a man in the face unless they were about to rob or kill him. They'd taken a stagecoach 2 days earlier, shot the guard dead before he could lift his rifle, and cleaned the passengers of coin, jewelry, and whatever they could carry. But the job had left them with more attention than they liked. Now they needed a place to disappear for a while, somewhere no one would follow. When they spotted the lone cabin from the ridge, it seemed like a gift. A single man living out here meant no trouble, no witnesses, just supplies for the taking. Vern Cade, their leader, rode at the front. He was tall and narrow-shouldered, his long duster flaring behind him with every gallop. His face was angular, his mouth always half-smiling in a way that wasn't friendly. Behind him was Clay Doran, a bear of a man with hands like shovels and a scar running from his left ear to his collarbone. Next came Finch, small and sharp-eyed, forever fiddling with the hammer of his revolver. 2 brothers, Jeb and Lyle Mercer, followed, loyal only to each other and money. And last was Hank Holder, the youngest, still green enough to think outlaws lived by some code. None of them gave a thought to the man they were about to meet beyond what he might have in his pantry. The sun was dropping toward the ridges when they drew nearer, the light stretching their shadows long over the sand. Elias rose from his chair, set his cup on the porch rail, and stepped down into the yard. He didn't go inside for a weapon. He didn't bar the door. He simply stood there, hands loose at his sides, watching as the riders closed the distance. The cicadas seemed to grow louder, their song high and steady, drowning out even the soft thud of hooves. From the saddle, Finch gave a sharp laugh. "Look at him, Vern. Old feller's barely standing straight. Won't take more than a minute. Careful, Vern said without looking back. A rattler don't need to move fast to kill you. It was an odd thing to say, but none of them thought much on it. They had seen plenty of men like Boone in the frontier, loners who weren't tough enough for town life, living out their days in the dust until age or thirst took them. What they didn't see was the way Elias's eyes measured their approach, noting the lead horse's limp, the way the wind carried sound, the distance to his front door, the subtle twitch in Finch's trigger finger. The gang slowed to a walk when they were 30 yards out, the horse's breath misting in the cooling air. Vern's smile widened, though his eyes never softened. "Evening, old man," he called. "You've got yourself some company." Elias didn't answer right away. He took in each face, each weapon, and when he finally spoke, his voice was even, quiet enough that they had to lean forward to catch it. Not the kind I'd invite. Something in the way he said it made Finch's grin falter. Clay shifted in his saddle, glancing toward Vern. The leader just chuckled, shaking his head. "We're just looking for a bit of food, maybe a place to rest our boots. Won't be no trouble if you're hospitable." Elias's gaze didn't waver. Trouble's got a way of following men like you, whether you wanted to or not. The cicadas went silent then, as if the desert itself was listening. In the stillness, Vern's smile slipped, just for a heartbeat, before returning. "We'll see about that." High above them, the first stars began to show against the bruised sky. The heat of the day was fading, but the air still held the weight of something about to break. Elias Boone stood unmoving, a lone figure against the coming night, and though the outlaws thought they had chosen him, it was the land, and perhaps fate itself, that had chosen them. They would not understand this until it was far too late. Sundown painted the desert in blood and gold, the horizon smudged with the last streaks of light before night claimed it. Against that dying glow, 6 figures rode in single file along the ridge, their shapes black and sharp against the sky. The wind carried the sound of their horses, leather creaking, hooves grinding over loose stone, the occasional snort as the animals caught the scent of dust and sage. From his porch, Elias Boone stood as he had for the last half hour, still as a fence post, his shadow stretching long across the yard. It was a stillness that could belong to a man waiting for trouble, or to something far more dangerous, the stillness of a predator before the strike. He let his eyes settle on each rider in turn, studying their movements with the same calm care a hunter gives to a deer at the edge of a clearing. Vern Cade led them, tall and lean, his long duster snapping in the evening breeze. His eyes were hard, calculating, the kind that never lingered on a thing unless he'd already decided what to do with it. Behind him rode Clay Doran, heavy in the saddle, his thick arms bare beneath a torn shirt despite the cooling air. His revolver sat low on his hip, worn smooth from use, and the way his hand rested on the grip suggested he was already imagining the weight of it in a fight. Third came Finch, wiry as a fence rail, eyes darting at every shadow. His left thumb never stopped flicking the hammer of his pistol, a nervous habit or a promise. It was hard to tell. The Mercer brothers followed, Jeb with his mouth twisted into something between a grin and a sneer, Lyle with the same face, but eyes colder, emptier, as if all his warmth had leaked out years ago. At the back was Hank Colder, the youngest, still carrying a trace of softness in his cheeks. He looked more boy than man, but the rifle strapped across his back spoke of someone trying hard to belong. From their perspective, the old man on the porch barely warranted a second thought. They'd talked about him earlier on the trail, Finch calling him easy pickings, Clay saying they'd take what they needed and leave him alive if he was smart. Vern had said nothing for most of the ride, just let the others talk, his silence heavier than any threat. When he finally spoke, it was only to say, "Don't underestimate a man just because he's alone. Sometimes the quiet ones got the most ghosts in their pockets." They'd laughed at that, but not as hard as they might have. Elias shifted his weight slightly, not out of discomfort but calculation. He measured the distance between the porch and the corral, the angle of the fence line, the lay of the ground between himself and the approaching riders. He noted the direction of the wind, which would carry sound to him faster than it would to them. His eyes drifted briefly toward the dry creek bed, cover if he needed it, and the faint shine of something metallic half-hidden near the woodpile. The land was as much a weapon as any firearm, and he knew every inch of it. A coyote's howl rose in the distance, long and mournful, answered by another farther off. The gang slowed their pace as they came down from the ridge, the fading sun throwing their faces into shadow. Vern raised a hand, signaling Clay and Finch forward. "Go have a word," he said. "See if the old man's worth talking to, or if we just take what we want." Clay's grin widened, the kind of smile that showed too many teeth. "Easy enough." Finch just nodded, spitting into the dust before spurring his horse ahead. They approached at a slow walk, the leather of their saddles groaning, dust rising in soft clouds around the horse's legs. Elias didn't move, didn't reach for a weapon, didn't even lean forward on the porch rail. When they were close enough to see the lines of his face, he spoke, his tone as steady as the wind. "Evening that." The word was simple, but something in the way it rolled out, measured, calm, without the slightest tremor, made Finch glance sideways at Clay. It was the kind of voice that didn't ask questions, because it already knew the answers. Clay cleared his throat. "Evening yourself. My name's Clay, this here's Finch. We're traveling through, and figured maybe you had something to spare. Water, food, maybe a roof for the night." Elias's eyes moved over them, pausing just long enough to unsettle without being obvious. "Roof's mine," he said. "Food and water depends." "Depends," Finch echoed, his thumb still tapping the hammer of his revolver. "Depends on what exactly?" "On whether you plan to leave peaceably come morning," Elias said. "Some men take more than they're given." Clay laughed, but it came out forced. "You worry too much, old man." Elias's gaze shifted, not to their faces, but to their hands, their weapons, the way the reins twitched in their grip. Then his eyes flicked past them to where Vern sat on his horse, watching without moving. "Some worries are worth having," Elias said. Clay's laughter faltered, his grin tightening. Finch opened his mouth to speak, but Elias had already turned away, as if the matter was settled. It wasn't a dismissal exactly, but it carried the same weight, a quiet authority neither outlaw could name. The details of the yard pressed themselves into the edges of their minds as they sat there. The woodpile wasn't just stacked. It was cut into pieces so uniform they looked machined. The fence posts were set with exact spacing, the rope lashings tight as drumskin. Near the edge of the corral, a row of traps lay coiled and ready, their teeth polished and oiled, not a speck of rust on them. It was the kind of order that came from a man who thought ahead, planned for every outcome. Finch's eyes narrowed. "Ain't no farmer keeps his place this neat," he muttered, barely loud enough for Clay to hear. Clay shifted in the saddle, suddenly aware of the coyote calls again, closer now. He glanced back at Vern, who raised his eyebrows as if to ask what was taking so long. Clay forced a grin and called out, "Reckon we might have ourselves a host." Elias didn't answer. He just stood there, one hand resting lightly on the porch post, the other hanging loose at his side. The breeze lifted the edge of his shirt, and for a moment Finch thought he saw the worn leather of a holster, not hanging on his hip, but tucked high and forward, where a man could draw without wasted motion. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching long across the ground, and the air felt thick, charged. Somewhere between the porch and the ridge, something invisible had shifted. The ground rules had changed, though only one man truly knew it. Clay was the first to break the fragile stillness. He swung down from his saddle, boots thudding into the dust, the leather of his holster creaking as his hand settled heavy on the grip of his revolver. Finch followed slower, his narrow frame shifting side to side like a snake testing its range. The air between them and the porch felt tight, stretched thin, as if the whole desert was holding its breath to see what came next. "Figure we ought to make it clear," Clay said, voice low but carrying. His eyes never left Elias's face, and in them was the cruel satisfaction of a man who'd broken others for less. "You can give us what we want the easy way, or we can take it." Elias didn't move, didn't so much as blink. Clay took one more step, then with a snap of muscle went for his revolver. It never cleared the holster. There was a sound, not loud, but sharp, like dry twigs breaking, and Clay's hand dropped the gun before his brain caught up with the pain. His wrist bent wrong, bones cracked and swelling under the skin, the weapon thudding uselessly into the dirt. He let out a bellow that tore through the quiet evening, clutching the injury to his chest as his knees buckled. Finch froze, eyes darting between Clay's gasping face and the old man still standing on the porch. Elias hadn't taken a step forward, yet the movement had been there, too fast to see, like watching lightning in the corner of your eye. Finch's instinct screamed at him to draw, to answer whatever just happened with his own steel, but before he could pull the barrel clear, there was a sudden tug in his hand. He looked down to find the revolver's cylinder hanging loose, the pin cleanly pulled, rounds rolling out one by one into the dust. The weapon was still in his grip, but now it was no more dangerous than a child's toy. His fingers tightened, useless, the pieces rattling softly in his palm. "What?" he started, but the word fell apart in his mouth. Up on the ridge, Vern Cade and the others had a clear view of everything. They'd seen Clay's arm snap in an instant, seen Finch standing there like a man who'd just woken from a bad dream, holding a broken gun. Vern's easy posture vanished. He leaned forward in the saddle, lips pressed thin, eyes narrowing on the man on the porch. Whatever Elias Boone was, he wasn't some weather-beaten settler barely clinging to his land. The silence around them grew heavy, like the moment before a stampede. For Elias, the moment passed as cleanly as it came. His breathing hadn't changed, his stance unshaken. His eyes were on Clay for a heartbeat longer, as if measuring whether the man could still ride, before they slid over to Finch, who stood locked in confusion. The look wasn't gloating. It wasn't even angry. It was simply assessing, as if Elias was working out whether either of them was still worth his time. The scene shifted in his mind without warning. The dusty porch faded to a place thick with smoke and the copper tang of blood. Men shouted in the distance, their words swallowed by the crack of rifles and the boom of distant artillery. The air was alive with heat and grit. Elias moved low between torn earthworks, the weight of a rifle snug against his shoulder, his boots sinking in mud churned with something darker. He remembered the flash of uniforms, the wild eyes of young men who didn't yet know how short their days would be, the strange clarity that came when you could pick out a single target in the chaos and make them vanish before they took their next breath. And then, as quickly as it came, the battlefield dissolved. The porch returned, the air cool in the oncoming night, Clay groaning on his knees and Finch staring down at the useless iron in his hand. Vern's voice carried from the ridge. "Mount up." It was low, but it cut through the air like a blade. Jeb and Lyle exchanged glances, but didn't argue. Hank shifted in his saddle, looking more confused than afraid, but he followed the others as they wheeled their horses away from the cabin. Clay managed to haul himself upright with his good arm, teeth gritted against the pain. Finch dropped what was left of his revolver and retrieved his horse's reins, his face pale. Neither said a word to Elias as they climbed back into their saddles. They turned and followed the rest of the gang up toward the ridge, the hoofbeats fading until the desert swallowed them. Elias remained on the porch a few seconds longer, scanning the ridge line until the last rider was gone. Then he stepped back inside, the floorboards soft under his boots. The air inside was cooler, touched with the scent of cedar from the wood stacked neatly against the wall. He shut the door and turned the lock with a slow, deliberate click. The oil lamp on the table flared to life under his match, its glow pushing back the shadows that had already begun creeping in through the windows. He sat down in the chair by the table, leaning back so it creaked, and reached for the coffee cup he'd left earlier. The brew was cold, but he drank it without a grimace. Outside, the wind moved across the sand, brushing against the cabin's walls like a quiet hand. Night deepened in layers. Stars began to pierce the dark, sharp and clear, each one cold and distant. The desert spoke again, low and constant, the whisper of sand shifting, the call of something unseen far out past the creek bed, the faint rustle of brush as the wind carried itself toward the horizon. Elias listened without hurry, without strain, every sound fitting into the map of the land he carried in his head. Beyond that ridge, men were deciding what came next. He knew they'd be back, because greed and pride always came back. But he also knew they'd return with the knowledge that the ground they were standing on wasn't theirs, and the man they meant to rob wasn't the one they thought he was. That knowledge had weight. and by the time they carried it to his door again, it would either slow their hands or seal their fates. The desert night came on quick and absolute, a blanket of darkness stitched with cold stars. A half-moon hung low over the horizon, spilling just enough silver to make every shadow look like something alive. Out beyond the ridge, the Iron Fong gang waited until the wind was steady and the world had gone still before they moved. Their plan was simple: close in from all sides, break the old man's defenses before he knew they were there. In their minds, darkness was their ally. In truth, it was his. Elias sat inside. The lamp turned low so only a faint halo touched the room. He didn't pace or peek out the window. He listened. Every shift of sand, every strained creak of leather came to him in the silence. He could tell where they were without seeing them. Clay's breathing was ragged from his injured wrist, somewhere to the west. Finch's cautious steps whispered through the dry grass to the north. The Mercer brothers moved together, low and sure, the way they always did. Vern was the one Elias couldn't hear, which meant he was the one to watch. The first mistake came quick. Lyle Mercer's boot landed on a warped plank of wood left just outside the corral. It gave a sharp groan, loud enough to freeze him mid-step. Elias had placed it there weeks ago, knowing the land well enough to use even its flaws. Lyle cursed under his breath, but the sound had already told Elias where he was. From the east, Jeb tried for the window. The moonlight caught on the blade of his knife as he pried at the shutters. A sudden shift in the wind carried the scent of oiled steel into the cabin, and Elias moved. The soft scrape of a rope uncoiling from the wall was the only sound before a shadow darted across the yard. There was a grunt, a muffled curse, and Jeb was yanked off his feet, the snare tightening around his ankle and dragging him into the dust. By the time he'd cut himself free, the quiet had swallowed him again. Finch came next, crouched low, pistol ready. His eyes darted to every corner, but missed the thin line of sand that Elias had raked smooth earlier in the day. A single step disturbed it, and in the moonlight, Elias saw the faint puff of grit. That was all he needed. The old Winchester in his hands whispered once, and the shot shattered the lantern Finch carried, plunging him back into darkness. The bullet never touched him, but the message was clear. He'd been seen, measured, and spared. For now. To the west, Clay cursed as sand burst into his face, thrown with precision from the porch. He staggered, coughing and wiping at his eyes, the injury to his wrist making his movements clumsy. By the time he could see again, the ground ahead was empty, no target to fire on. Then the moonlight revealed Elias. He stepped out from the shadows without a gun in sight, his hands hanging loose, his face calm. He moved with a quiet certainty, crossing the yard like a man who had nothing to fear from the 6 armed men hidden in the dark. Boone, Vern's voice called, low but carrying. He stepped into the open too, his long duster catching the breeze. The 2 men faced each other across the yard, the silence between them thick enough to feel. "You should have kept riding," Elias said. "And you should have stayed a ghost," Vern replied. "Didn't think I'd find you this far out." The words hung there, charged with something the others couldn't place. Clay's eyes flicked between them, trying to read the undercurrent. "You found me," Elias said, "but you didn't bring enough men." Vern's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Men ain't the measure here. You and me both know that." "Then you know how this ends." "Maybe I do," Vern said, tilting his head. "But I came anyway." Neither moved for a long moment. The moon painted the land in silver and shadow, the wind weaving between them like a restless spirit. Then a sound cut through it, the sharp snap of a trap closing. Hank Holder's scream followed, high and desperate. Elias's eyes didn't leave Vern's. "That'll be one less." Vern's jaw tightened. Somewhere in the dark, the others scrambled toward the sound, but the night was against them. By the time they freed Hank, the boy's leg was a mess of torn flesh and cloth, his face white with pain. "We're leaving," Vern said finally. His voice was steady, but the fight had gone from it. "You were never staying," Elias replied. They backed away into the dark, the moon catching their shapes one last time before the ridge swallowed them. Elias stood in the yard until the sound of their horses faded, the quiet of the desert returning piece by piece. Then he turned and walked back inside, the door closing with the soft finality of a man who knew the night belonged to him. The first blush of morning spilled over the ridge like molten gold, painting the desert in a light too honest for men like Vern Cade. From his vantage point, he surveyed his gang, or what was left of it, hollow-eyed and sunburnt. Their hands shook when they reached for water. The wind carried the dry whisper of their dwindling supplies, flimsy canteens rattling with the last mouthfuls, jerky gone to dust. None of them said it out loud, but the air reeked of fear and defeat. Vern spat into the sand, trying to coat the bitterness on his tongue. "We finish it today," he growled. His voice was gravel and fire, but his men heard the desperation under it. "Before we starve, before that bastard picks us off like rabbits." No one argued. In the silence that followed, the desert seemed to listen. Down at the homestead, Elias stepped onto his porch like a man walking into the day's work, not a siege. His eyes tracked the ridges, the shadows, the soft shift of light where dust hung in the air from unseen riders. He knew what was coming. Moving back inside, he knelt by the warped floorboards in the corner. His fingers found the old iron latch, and with a practiced pull, the wood lifted. Beneath lay a chest, the kind made for men who traveled with armies, not wagons. The hinges didn't squeal when he opened it. He'd kept them oiled, though he hadn't touched what was inside in years. The gleam of steel caught the sun through the narrow window. A Colt, clean to perfection. An old Winchester, stock-polished like riverstone. And at the bottom, folded as crisply as the day it was put away, a military coat, dark, heavy, and smelling faintly of gunpowder long past. He set the coat aside and began loading weapons, each motion as calm as if he were mending a fence. Outside, a low thunder began, hoofbeats rolling across the sand, building into a charge. The Iron Fang gang came as one, a storm of dust and fury. The first shot cracked before they even hit the yard. A rider pitched sideways, his rifle tumbling into the dirt. Elias didn't wait for the echo to fade. He shifted, fired again, and another outlaw went down, his hat spinning away in the wind. They came in hard after that, yelling to drown their own fear. Bullets punched splinters from the cabin walls, the air thick with grit and smoke. Elias moved like the fight was a dance he'd practiced 1,000 times. He used the shadows, the cover of his own home, each step deliberate, each shot finding a target. When a rider broke through the fence line, Elias didn't aim for the man. He shot the horse's stirrup strap clean through, sending both sprawling. The homestead was chaos, dust choking the air, gunfire ringing like hammer strikes. Men shouted, cursed, screamed. But through it all, Elias never rushed. Every time he squeezed the trigger, another threat fell away. By the time the dust began to settle, only one man remained mounted, his horse breathing hard in the growing heat. Vern Cade reined in just beyond the fence, staring at the still figure on the porch. His gang lay scattered behind him, some groaning, some still as stone. The two men stood in the open now, the world narrowing to the stretch of desert between them. Elias stepped forward, Winchester slung across his back, hands empty. The wind combed through his hair, lifting the corner of that folded military coat, now resting over one shoulder. Vern's eyes flicked to it, and something shifted in his face, a recognition that went deeper than memory, pulling from old stories told in saloons and campfires. His jaw tightened, but his gun stayed holstered. "You," Vern said, the word heavy. Elias's voice was low, steady as bedrock. "Me." The space between them held years neither spoke of, battles fought, names buried, debts written in blood. Vern's fingers twitched near his hip, but the weight of the silence pressed harder than any trigger. When Vern finally reached for his gun, Elias moved, not with the flash of speed from before, but with the inevitability of a closing door. His shot hit the sand an inch from Vern's boot, the sound cracking like a warning bell. Vern froze. Elias stepped closer until the heat from the day seemed to gather between them. "You tell whoever sent you," he said, each word measured. "The frontier's not for the taking. Not while I'm still breathing." Vern's mouth opened, then shut again. He swallowed, turned his horse, and rode slow into the horizon, the weight of the message heavier than the sun beating on his back. Elias watched until the dust swallowed him, then turned toward the cabin. Inside, the oil lamp still burned from the night before. He set the Winchester down, slid the coat back into the chest, and lowered the floorboards into place. Outside, the desert stretched silent and endless, the only movement the shimmer of heat rising from the sand. Somewhere far off, a lone coyote cried to the morning. Elias poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the table, as if nothing had happened at all. Vern's horse staggered under the weight of exhaustion, each hoofbeat sending up little clouds of dust that dissolved into the growing heat. His face was pale beneath the grit, his eyes sunken, fixed on nothing. The desert stretched endlessly before him, but the cabin, the man within it, lingered behind his eyes like a phantom that refused to be shaken. When he finally reached the nearest settlement, his voice was hoarse, cracked from thirst and defeat, yet the words tumbled out to anyone who would listen. They gathered around him at the saloon, the barkeep pausing mid-polish of a glass, card players folding their hands without protest. Vern's tale spilled like an open wound, gunfire in the dawn. Men cut down before they could breathe, the silence that followed broken only by the wind through the mesquite. He spoke of a man who moved like the desert itself, patient and merciless, as if the land and the shadows bent to his will. He called him Boone, but there was a tremor in his tone, as though even speaking the name was dangerous. Some leaned forward, hungry for every detail. Others leaned back, eyes narrowing in doubt. They'd heard stories before, too many tales spun from whiskey and regret, but there was something in Vern's voice, some quiver of truth, that made the room feel a little colder. One old rancher spat into the sawdust and muttered he'd heard of such a man once, back when the war was still tearing the country apart. Not a settler, not a drifter, something else, something worse. Over the next days, the story spread like wildfire through dry grass. In towns where Vern had never set foot, folks were already whispering of the lone man in the cabin and the gang foolish enough to push him. Some claimed he was once a bounty hunter who never missed his mark. Others swore he was an outlaw turned vigilante, paying for sins in blood. And yet, beneath the changing details, one thing stayed the same. He was no ordinary soul. Far from the talk and the rumors, Elias Boone stood in the quiet dawn, the air still cool before the sun's hammer began its work. He leaned on the fence post, surveying the expanse of his land. The corral gate creaked in the wind, and the scent of dry earth and sage drifted around him. His hands were steady, worn from years of work and things far older than ranching. The cabin stood behind him, a simple shape of timber and stone, giving away nothing of the storms it had endured. He knelt beside a patch of tilled soil, pressing the dirt between his fingers like he was testing its life. To any passerby, he was just a man tending to his land, his gaze slow and thoughtful. No one would guess the speed hidden in those hands, the precision in those eyes. No one would imagine that inside the cabin, beneath the floorboards, lay weapons kept cleaner than church silver, or the long military coat, folded with the reverence of a burial shroud. The truth of Elias Boone lived not in the rumors, but in the silence of his past. He had once been a scout for the U.S. Army, the one they sent ahead when they needed the impossible done without a sound. To his brothers in arms, he was Ghost Hand, a name whispered in both fear and respect. It was said he could fire before you knew he'd moved, that he could track a man for days without leaving a trace of his own passing. On the battlefield, he had been the last thing some men ever saw. But wars end and soldiers scatter. Boone had chosen the frontier not to find peace, but to disappear. Out here, the land demanded patience, the kind that made a man hard to see until it was far too late. He had buried Ghost Hand beneath years of quiet work, miles from any army, any cause. And for the most part, it had stayed buried, until the Iron Fang gang came looking for an easy mark. Now, as the wind whispered across the plains, the weight of what had happened settled into the soil, like seeds no one wanted to grow. Somewhere out there, Vern Cade was still riding, carrying Boone's message across the lawless stretches of the West. Asterisk, tell them the frontier's not for the taking. Not while I'm still breathing, asterisk. The years would add polish to the tale, sanding away the truth until it gleamed like legend. Children yet unborn would hear of the settler who bested a gang before they could draw their first breath. Some would believe it, others would laugh. But every rider who crossed into that corner of the desert would feel it, that prickle at the back of the neck, the sense that unseen eyes were measuring them. And in the long memory of the frontier, where men and deeds are carried on the wind long after bones have turned to dust, the name Elias Boone, ghost hand would remain. Not a hero, not a villain, but a warning that some parts of the West are wild not because of the land, but because of the men who guard it.